Welcome everyone, Christine here with a discussion about World of Warcraft Wrath the Lich King Classic to talk about heroic dungeons in Wrath. My impressions so far. I've played through all of them in the beta. It took me about 4.5 hours, and I do just want to share my impressions of what I experienced doing these heroic dungeons in Wrath. Were there bugs? Yes. Were they easy? Difficult? And what did I think of them overall? Well, when it came to bugs, absolutely there were bugs. The biggest one I noticed was with the noob Arak with his pound ability. He's supposed to do pound basically on the tank just moves out of the way, avoids it, nothing to it really. But in the beta, he was doing pound, and whenever he did pound, he was going to kill the melee that you had in your group, or anyone in melee range. He was going to hit them with that pound ability. Did quite a bit of damage. That's not exactly how the ability was supposed to work, but yeah, it's a bug right now in the beta. That's the biggest by far, but there were other issues like missing abilities on certain mobs or abilities not working correctly, and some smaller issues of that nature. For the most part, the dungeons were workable. There was nothing completely game-breaking, and even the noob Arak issue, while annoying certainly, was something we could deal with. So the dungeons are, for the most part, functional. Not perfectly so, but they are functional, they are doable, and there's not too many significant problems, I feel, for Blizzard to fix when it comes to the heroic dungeons. Music not working in certain locations, certain abilities missing, but yeah, for the most part, they're perfectly workable. Now, what do I think about Wrath Heroics? Well, I think that in Wrath the Lich King, there were a lot of interesting ideas for dungeons. Some of them worked out, some of them didn't, or a lot of them didn't. One of the things that absolutely didn't work out was the idea of either waves or RP or events, dungeon events where you're just there wasting time. And this applies to some of the dungeons like Halls of Stone, Violet Hold, etc., where you just have a lot of downtime because the game forces you to have that downtime, or you have an RP event before the boss spawns or something along that nature. You do have that situation popping up quite a bit in Wrath the Lich King, so there is certainly frustration when it comes to that. As for difficulty, well, they were very easy in terms of what we dealt with. Now, keep in mind that in the beta, we get max level template characters that, although they don't have pre-raid best in slot, they're pretty close to it. And of course, we get free consumables, more or less, gems, etc. So people in the beta are using much better gear than people will be using when Wrath the Lich King Classic comes out. However, there is another side to this perspective, in that a lot of people are going to go into Wrath the Lich King with Black Temple, Mount Hyjal, and especially Sunwell gear, which is really good in its own right. Like Black Temple, Mount Hyjal, and Sunwell gearing is all very good. And although not pre-raid best in slot, close enough that people would have a similar level of power to what we did have here, unless we're talking about the Fresh Realms, where I'm personally going to be playing Wrath of the Lich King Classic. Then yeah, people are going to start from scratch. But point is, the dungeons were very easy and honestly very boring for the most part. There's some cool stuff, I won't deny it. There's some really cool stuff in it, but it does wear down its welcome, so to speak, very, very quickly. And that's always been the case in Wrath dungeons. There's never been just the tension you feel in a dungeon like, say, Shatter Halls. There's never been the teeth clenching situation like in Mana Tombs or Alcatraz. That's never been the case in Wrath dungeons. They made them way, way too easy. Even when they came out, this is not the case of like, oh, Wrath is easy now with all the talents and of course all the gear we get in the beta. That's not the case. Like, I remember going into the TPC beta, going into Durnhold Heroic and getting my teeth kicked in by the first boss. That's not the situation you're gonna encounter doing heroic dungeons in Wrath the Lich King. So the dungeons are fast, 10-20 minutes I'd say on average, some a bit longer, 30 minutes, especially those where you do have mandatory RP events. Those are generally going to be longer, but by and large I'd say anywhere between 10, maybe 15 really, 15 to 20 minutes for each dungeon. And that, as far as I see it, is not necessarily a problem in itself. If you have fast, easy dungeons, that's not necessarily an issue, though yeah, it's certainly does reduce the enjoyment you can have with it. Because if there's nothing at stake, if you know you're gonna win, then what are you playing for? Well, there has to be some reward, some reason you're doing this. But there's the crux of the issue, I feel, with Wrath Heroics, that there isn't much of a reward from these dungeons except reputation and badges. In terms of gear, yeah, sure, there are certain pieces of gear, trinkets, weapons, etc., that people do need, but for the most part, that generally comes down to a number of dungeons, certainly not all of them, but a number of dungeons where people need some pieces of gear, and some are more important than others. I'd say outside of like weapons, shields, and trinkets, everything else is nowhere near as important. You have plenty of choices from reputation items. You have plenty of crafted choices that aren't necessarily too expensive, and you have a lot of gear from both badges of heroism and, once you start raiding, badges of valor. So really, one of the problems I see with Wrath of the Lich King heroic dungeons is that you're not really doing them for the rewards, for the items that drop. You're doing them for the badges, for the reputations, and maybe the epic items that drop from certain bosses. You can skip a lot and not really miss out on much, or you can be doing dungeon after dungeon after dungeon and not seeing a single item that you're interested in as a player. Especially if you're going to start this with full Sunwell Plateau gearing, you're mainly going to be doing it for the badges that drop from them and for the reputation. Now, this is because Blizzard did add a lot of gear to reputation vendors that is very, very good, and it's eye level 200. And even if it's not eye level 200, it's still pretty solid gear that's comparable or pretty much on par with any gear that does drop from these heroic dungeons. And then there's a large number of gear that you get from badges of heroism, and then gear, of course, from badges of valor. So what it feels like to me, and what it has always felt like to me when it comes to dungeons, heroic dungeons in Wrath of the Lich King, is that the incentive structure for a player isn't really that great. Now, it's going to be different in Wrath Classic than it was on retail, because on retail, you got badges of heroism from 10 men, and you got badges of valor from 25 men. And what that meant is you really weren't even giving a crap about doing the heroic dungeons past, like, I know, first week, 2 weeks. You weren't even doing them for the badges of heroism because you were getting those from raiding anyway, from 10-man raiding, but rather you were doing the daily heroic, which is only going to be the case in Wrath Classic as well, but you were doing the daily heroic for the sake of the valor points, which were more limited. But here's how Blizzard flipped that on its head. What Blizzard has decided to do so far in the beta, and maybe there's some changes that they will implement. They've talked about maybe changing things around with increasing the difficulty of dungeons throughout the expansion, making them more relevant throughout the expansion, etc. Without just being a loot pinata or a badge pinata, if you will, in all of Wrath of the Lich King. They've talked about that. They haven't delivered anything on that so far. They're very easy. They don't feel really that very relevant. But here's how they changed it. You can only get badges of heroism through dungeons at the moment. In badges of valor, yes, you still have the daily quest, but you also get badges of valor from 10-man raiding. So there's less incentive to do the daily heroic as a player, but there's more incentive to do a lot of heroics for the sake of badges of heroism. What that means is people are going to be more incentivized early on to do a lot of heroic dungeons, but they're going to be less incentivized later on to do these dungeons. And I think that they're going to be a ghost town past the first couple of weeks, which honestly is a shame. Like, whenever I thought about Wrath of the Lich King dungeons, I felt that they did some things very well, that some things were very interesting about them, but there was never a compelling reason to really care about them all that much. Not from a loot perspective, and yeah, sure, reputation and badges, but that only lasts so long. You will fix your reputations very quickly, actually, after a couple of days even, and you will fix your badges of heroism also pretty quickly. Unless you're interested in a lot of off-spec gear, but even then, it's not going to last for a very long period of time. So the dungeons are not going to remain relevant for very long. And I do want to contrast this to the TBC situation, because yes, there is a contrast. In TBC, dungeon gearing, even normal dungeon gearing, was very relevant for quite a long period of time. There were items that you can get from dungeons in TBC that you could use for an entire tier or even 2 tiers, like some trinkets as an example, or Nick to help you with silences, or a Libram for Retribution Paladins that was best on slot for pretty much the entire expansion until maybe Sunwell Plateau, or a Libram for Production Paladins for the sake of Fret, and on and on and on. But the point I'm getting to, there were many reasons. Like, you had rep, you had badges, you had gear drops that were actually relevant, you had a lot more dungeons, and they were more difficult. That's why, in my opinion, heroic dungeons in TBC were vastly superior to anything Wrath provided. And it's actually kind of a shame, because Wrath the Lich King dungeons should be better. You should have better reasons to do them than you have right now, but you just don't. And that's the current situation. I do think that if you haven't done these dungeons in a while, in years, yeah, you will enjoy them for a couple of days, maybe a week or 2, but after that you're just gonna drop them and never bother with them again, unless you're doing a daily heroic for Badges of Valor and then Conquest, etc. And for alts. And that's just where the situation is with regards to Wrath of the Lich King heroic dungeons. Now, I do want to talk about certain dungeons themselves. I was thinking about rating every single individual dungeon in the game, but honestly, a lot of them just kind of fall on the mediocre scale. Some people have asked me, it's like, what's your favorite dungeon in Wrath of the Lich King, however? And my answer to that question has always been, it's like, I don't have any, because none of them are particularly great. Like, none of them compared to something like doing, the experience that you can have in like a Durnhold heroic, or even though it's brutally hard, but it is an experience, it is something memorable. There's nothing quite like that. There are dungeons that are very memorable in Cataclysm, there are dungeons that are very memorable on retail even, but not so much in Wrath, sadly enough. But anyway, when it comes to the top 3 worst dungeons in Wrath the Lich King, here's my list. At the absolute worst spot, we have Halls of Stone. Why so? Well, Halls of Stone is a pretty quick dungeon. You can skip 2 of the bosses out of 4. Just go do the Brand Bronzebeard event boss. The problem here is you're wasting about 5-6 minutes of your life dealing with non-elite mobs that are very easy to kill. It's not particularly challenging. It's never been particularly challenging. And then you have the final boss. He can be challenging if you don't have any good gear, but when any decent gearing, he's gonna be a joke. So Halls of Stone, absolute worst dungeon, because although it can be fast, the way it's actually done, like, yeah, you can do this dungeon genuinely like, 10 to 12 minutes, something along those lines, dependent on how fast you're clearing the trash. But the fact you're wasting so many minutes of your life on a dumb boss encounter that isn't fun or challenging in any way really drags the experience down. After that, we have Violet Hold, a wave-based dungeon where you're waiting for portals to open or waves of elite enemies to spawn that you then deal with. But that's basically like Black Morass. And sure, Black Morass isn't a great dungeon either. It's like the black sheep, if you will, of the family of dungeons in TBC. But in certain ways, Violet Hold is actually worse. Yes, worse. Because 2 of the 3 bosses you deal with are random bosses. There's a number of boss encounters that you can get in the dungeon, and 2 of them will be randomized. And there's a number of reasons why this is actually pretty terrible. The first one is, maybe, in this case, there are certain items people may want from those random bosses. Now, there's not a lot of items people want from heroic dungeons, but the sad part about Violet Hold is that it's one of the dungeons people actually do want to do. Like, as a tank, you do want to do them. As a you do want to do it until you get what you want. As a DPSer, you want to do it until you get what you want. But you're reliant on an RNG system to spawn the boss you want, and then obviously the RNG to give you the item that you need. And then you may be competing with other people as well for that item. That is an absolutely terrible experience. By far and away the worst experience that you can have in any dungeon, I think, in the entire history of the game in World of Warcraft. Then there is Stratholme Heroic. Now, it may not seem so bad, but you do have to deal with about a dozen waves of mobs in the early part of the dungeon. Then you've got a bunch of RP, you have a bunch of RP to even start it, a bunch of RP, an escort. Yes, escorts in MMOs, that's a wonderful situation. The overall experience, although Stratholme is one of the most important events in Warcraft history because it represented Arthas's downfall, the way they handled it as a dungeon, in general with Caverns of Time, I feel like with a lot of the Caverns of Time dungeons and even raids, they did a pretty piss poor job. The only exception I feel is like Durnhold, and maybe we can think about the Well of Eternity and Cataclysm, or not. But either way, the point that I'm getting to here is Stratholme is not a good dungeon in any way, shape, or form. Now, as for the best dungeons, quote unquote, or the least miserable dungeons in the entire expansion, I would have to go with Drakfaron Keep first up and number 3 on this list. Drakfaron Keep can be a bit hard. Actually has a level of challenge, at least in the early part, the undead part, the first part of the dungeon. You can skip 2 of the bosses if you so desire, so you do have that going for it. You do have a decent level of challenge, and it's a pretty straightforward dungeon. Both the troll dungeons in Wrath of the Lich King are fairly straightforward challenges, and they do have higher levels of damage in them. And so Drakfaron Keep honestly is a better dungeon to run than many others in the game from my perspective, because there's a level of tension there, because surprisingly you can actually fail, you can actually wipe here in this dungeon, even if it's only in the first part, the first section, if you will, out of the 4 sections that this dungeon has. Even if it's only in that section, at least it's something that a lot of other dungeons in the game don't have. So Drakfaron Keep number 3 in terms of the least worst dungeons. Then we have Jol Nerub. Yes, why is it Jol Nerub? Is it because it's challenging? No, it's a joke of a dungeon. It's very quick, very easy. Pounding issue notwithstanding, but that's just a bug. A Jol Nerub is a fast, quick dungeon that does offer rewards people need. And that's why it's second on this list. It doesn't provide any decent level of challenge, even with the bug. Yeah, just have people move out on a pound. People will figure that out very, very quickly, even if you have to wipe a couple of times for them to figure out. But this is easily the fastest dungeon you can do entire expansion, especially if you get gear. In certain dungeons in Wrath, it doesn't matter what gear level you have, you will still be slowed down by the RP, by the events. Here you do have a bit of a slowdown effect, but if you have enough gear, you can even bypass that on the second boss. So very quick, very fast, very easy to do dungeon. And then finally, at the top of the list of the least worst dungeons in Wrath, it has to be Gundrak. Why Gundrak? Fairly straightforward dungeon, fairly fast, not necessarily very easy. Does have a decent amount of challenge to it, at least as far as Wrath heroic dungeons go for. So Gundrak is actually the closest to being an enjoyable dungeon to do in Wrath. It's also interesting that you do have 2 entrances in it that do play out a bit differently. Not too much of a major difference between these 2 entrances, but at least there's some variety in that. And so Gundrak, I feel, is probably the closest to being a good dungeon in Wrath of the Lich King Classic. But that's all I had to say on this subject. I don't think much of the heroic dungeons in Wrath of the Lich King, and I think that they're gonna wear out their welcome very, very quickly in a way that vanilla, BC, or even Cataclysm dungeons never did. That's kind of the thing that has to be said about Wrath dungeons. They weren't great even back in the day, to be quite honest with you. Cataclysm had some very memorable dungeons. TBC had some very memorable dungeons, and so did vanilla. Even in Classic, people did a lot of Stratholme, people did a lot of UBRS, people did a lot of dungeons in vanilla. It wasn't a completely terrible experience. I think it really comes down to that incentive structure that makes or breaks an experience, a PvE experience. Like, if you're not doing something for the loot, and you're not doing something for the challenge, and you're only doing it really for reputation and badges, that's not really a great experience to have. And that's probably what sets the Wrath of the Lich King heroic dungeons apart. And one of the things to note, by the way, is this actually doesn't apply while you're leveling. While you're leveling, you do care about the gear. The level of challenge is actually greater. unless you're stacked to the teeth with Black Temple gear, but those dungeons clearly were not designed for people with full Black Temple Sunwell Plateau gear. But the heroic dungeons should be designed for people that have a decent level of gearing and should provide a challenge that's appropriate for those people, and yet they do not and never have. That's the issue with them. Anyway, Costine here, signing out. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and enable notifications. If you do enjoy my content, please join my Discord. I do post my videos that I'm doing on this channel there. Much easier to keep track of it. And if you do want to show me your appreciation, and it would be very much welcome in this particular period for me, given certain issues I'm dealing with in real life, consider donating via PayPal or Patreon. Links are in the description. Even $1 is greatly appreciated. Stay tuned for more, everyone.